Mr McLeod, and we'll go to the Australia Institute.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to appear today and to discuss how this bill could strengthen Australia's climate framework, both in terms of reporting, mitigation and adaptation. I thought I'd just provide a concrete point on each of these three areas: reporting, mitigation and adaptation, beginning with reporting. Right now, Australia has a good model for climate reporting, and this is emissions reporting in particular. It's in the hands of capable officials, many of whom you heard from on Friday. Australia has even exported this expertise by helping a number of our neighbours set up their emissions accounting systems. But more could be done to improve the transparency and accountability of this emissions reporting framework. So on Friday, the Department of Energy, Rob Sturgis, reiterated that the government provides quarterly emissions data with a 5-month lag. So in December, we should be receiving the data set up until June of that year. That's how the system's supposed to work, however, it hasn't in the past. Instead, the reports come out late and they come out at quite inconvenient times. In December 2016, the government released the March 2016 and June 2016 reports on the Thursday before Christmas alongside the emissions projections. The March report was released 9 months after the quarter had ended. In 2017, again, there were delays. The government incorporated the September quarter figures into the December report and then pushed it out before Christmas again. And the report was only released when FOI documents showed that that report had already been complete and hadn't been released yet. The data is regularly released late, often at times that are inconvenient, what's commonly known as taking out the trash, either late on a Friday or on a long weekend. Another example was the March 2018 quarterly emissions data that was put out on the eve of the grand final. So in 2018, the Senate attempted to correct the climate reporting system by passing a motion introducing rolling deadlines for the quarterly emissions data, what is known as the Order of Continuing Effect, which requires the government to table the emissions data within 5 months of the end of each quarter or explain the delay. This has been an improvement, and we've seen an improvement in the system, but it shouldn't come to this. These are the qualities that we expect of our current system, and something like this bill could help correct. In terms of mitigation, reducing Australia's emissions, since 2005, a group of international think tanks have analysed countries' climate efforts in the annual Climate Change Performance Index. They look at 57 countries that collectively make up 90% of the world's emissions. The 2020 iteration of this report ranked Australia as the worst performing country on climate change policy. But when questions about this, the Prime Minister stated that he completely rejected the report. He doesn't accept the report, and when asked why, he said it wasn't credible. It's disappointing that Australia should take on board international comparisons that aren't necessarily positive. Just like taking out the trash with bad emissions data, you can't necessarily ignore bad ratings as well. There's an opportunity to take that information on board, and that's something that we'd expect this independent commission to actually examine. Because there is some credibility to the fact that Australia should be doing a lot more on climate policy. Let's look at Australia's main policy from last year. That's the Technology Investment Roadmap. The consultation paper for the Technology Investment Roadmap laid out a number of technologies, almost 160, that were potentially available for Australia to undertake to meet its emission reduction commitment. However, there was no analysis provided, no data available as to the emissions reductions that could potentially come out of those 160 technologies. When the department was questioned through FOI that the Australian Institute put forward, it admitted that the figures that sat underneath those technologies were, I quote, simply departmental expert judgment. And, end quote, they hadn't been drawn on from independent research. And that's the kind of expertise that we're hoping this independent commission can bring. Because if you look at the number that the Technology Investment Roadmap came up with, it stated that it would avoid 250 million tonnes of emissions per year by 2040. There are two big problems with this number. The first, Australia has no target in 2040, no target in 2035. In fact, the government insists that there should be no target beyond 2030 until modelling has been done to set that out, and yet at the same time is banking on emissions reductions for 2040. The second issue is that 250 million tonnes will come from the deployment of priority technologies at home and Australia's low emissions exports. So what that's doing is it's trying to take credit for reducing emissions beyond Australia's shores. Australia is not responsible under UNFCCC accounting for emissions beyond its shores. And yet at the same time, the government is trying to take credit for avoiding these emissions. If Australia included its exported emissions, say through its coal and LNG that it exports, then Australia's carbon footprint would be 3 times what it is now. We can go down the path of looking at that, but right now it seems incongruous to include that as part of our emissions reductions going forward, unless we're going to look at the whole picture. Finally, on the point of adaptation, the Australian government does not have a comprehensive climate risk analysis of physical impacts. It does not have a national adaptation plan. The National Climate Resilience and Adaptation Strategy 2015 falls far short. And it was brought on at the same time that there were serious cuts to the CSIRO's climate adaptation flagship and the defunding of the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility. In the past, I worked for the Australian government, and I was the Australian government's lead negotiator to the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, on the issue of adaptation. I led Australia's negotiations on the development of an international framework to develop a national adaptation plan, and I co-chaired the UN negotiations that ultimately landed that deal. But when I came home, there was no interest or appetite to undertake a national adaptation plan. At the same time, the Australian government was funding these national adaptation plans in the Pacific and all around. And it seems incongruous, and it also is disappointing when you look at how ill-prepared we were for some of climate impacts that we faced in the last 12 months, most namely the Black Summer bushfires. It's good that the Royal Commission has come back with a number of recommendations for how we can improve things, but a Royal Commission is an ad hoc process, and what we need is a systematic improvement. And the approach of this bill to actually undertake a national climate risk assessment and proceed with a national adaptation plan seems like a solid move forward. Since this bill was introduced, we've already seen progress on climate change. Well, I think just an hour ago, the Prime Minister at the Press Club announced that he wants to see Australia get to net zero as soon as possible, preferably by 2050. That's great progress, and it's good to hear, but it's not concrete, and it's not legislated, and that's what this bill would do. So we see room to improve going forward, and this bill playing a key role in doing that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Merzian, and to all of you gentlemen for your opening statements. I might start with you, Mr Merzian, if we can, before I pass to colleagues. In the opening statements, you were talking about evidence we heard from the department last Friday, and you expressed some concerns about the timing of release of data. Your written submission goes further, though. Your written submission supports this bill. One of the bases for that is a belief that the independent body and independent methodology would be established to ensure reliability and accuracy. So we also heard from the department that Australia probably has the most comprehensive, timely and transparent systems in the world for this. So my question is, what data would the alternate methodology deliver, and what are the existing flaws on the accuracy and reliability of the current systems?
The point I just raised around the quarterly emissions data and the timeliness, I think, was the first front of mind point I'd like to raise.
But in terms of, I'm sorry, my question is reliability and accuracy was what you have raised in your own submission. So
Certainly.
Can you go to that, please, as opposed to, timely releases into the market?
Sure. So a good example is the emissions projections from 2019, which saw a revision of previous years in terms of the emissions baselines that weren't fully explained, and what they ultimately did was reduce what appeared to be a larger gap from previous emissions projections for future ones. We'd be happy to provide further information to set out these numbers, but ultimately what we see is when the annual emissions projections come out in December every year, it seems to be that the emissions gap between Australia's target, 26 to 28% by 2005, from 2030, it seems to be diminishing. Not only is it because of how Australia is going to be reducing emissions going forward, but also changes to previous emissions data sets from the past. Those emissions data sets aren't clearly explained, those changes aren't clearly explained. Some of it, we understand, comes from the IPCC in reviewing how it calculates those emissions.
So your problem, am I right, is with the explanation or lack thereof, not necessarily, to use your words, the accuracy?
Well, Chair, I believe it goes to the accuracy.
Okay.
In order to demonstrate accuracy, an explanation would help set out exactly why you've come to that conclusion. Right now, you need to take it on face value, and that's the real question.
Okay, can I go to another question then? You've mentioned in, I think, your opening paragraph of your submission, the current Australian government has failed to provide adequate funding to carry forward many of these insufficient policies. If the government has provided inadequate funding, what constitutes adequate funding? How much money are you talking?
Right now, the government has committed $2 billion to the Climate Solutions Fund, previously called the Emissions Reduction Fund, over a 15-year period. That's less money over a longer period of time to expect it to do more than it has done in the past. If Australia is to keep up with the emissions reductions that it currently plans, then you'd think it would be committing more rather than less funding. And the Climate Solutions Fund is a good example. Another example, Chair, would be around transport. Right now, there isn't a single policy to reduce Australia's transport emissions. They've dipped, but they've dipped because of the pandemic, which doesn't make for good climate policy. And so the real question would be, is the government willing to commit more funding? Because right now the only funding that is available to, say, electrify transport comes from the existing budget lines of the Australian Renewable Energy Agency and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation.
Understood. So it's a statement of principle, more money should be spent, as opposed to you don't have any modelling or anything or estimate. Is that right?
There's more information available as to the multitudes of policies that could be brought forward, and potential funding would be happy to provide that.
That'd be great, thank you. My last question, then I'll go to Deputy Chair Wilson. In your submission, you talk about the Independent Advisory Commission, and in particular, you compliment its design, and I'm quoting now, stipulating that the IAC is not subject to direction from the Commonwealth Government. So my question is, what role do you see as being the responsible role of elected officials and the executive of government when it comes to climate change?
Well, the elected officials will ultimately come up with a policy suite to meet the targets that have been agreed, taking advice from an independent commission. That's ultimately how we'll move forward, but that advice should be independent and it should be constructed in an independent fashion. I think a good example of what happens otherwise is what happened with the Climate Commission when it was ultimately reduced. Firstly, the Climate Commission was I think believed disbanded in 2013, and then the Climate Change Authority has since had its funding reduced, its footprint reduced, has been completely absorbed into the department and is no longer based at its previous headquarters.
Let me go to Deputy Chair Wilson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for your evidence today. My first question is to the folk from the CPD, and just picking up your reference to what's been missing in terms of a North Star. What I'd like you to offer some thoughts on, we had an economy-wide framework in the Clean Energy Future package up until 2013, and then to some extent since that time, some of the elements that were put in place, like ARENA and the CEFC and the Clean Energy Renewable Target, have sort of been winding down. The Clean Energy the Renewable Energy Target finished in 2020. The CEFC is currently being considered for a sort of a mandate change that would take its funding scope away from renewable energy into other technologies. What are the likely costs and impacts if we continue without the kind of framework and direction that you've identified, particularly as some of those legacies from the last time that we had a national framework either come to an end or continue to weaken?
Thanks for that question, Mr. Burns. I'll go first and then hand to to Sam Hurley. I
Sorry,
think
Mr.
that...
Cloud, sorry to interrupt, just for the sake of Hansard, that question was from Mr. Wilson, not Mr. Burns.
He's the better looking
Oh,
one.
Mr. Wilson,
Can't
so
see him.
apologies, Mr. Wilson. Thank you. So, I mean, to answer your question, the CFC and Arena are doing excellent work. I think to your question about what the consequences would be, I think it goes to scale and fragmentation. So we're seeing an enormous effort from CFC and Arena across sectors and supply chains, and greater scale and the ability to coordinate effort across jurisdictions, sectors, supply chains has been a focus of our Climate and Recovery Initiative, particularly insofar as it goes to achieving the goals of the technology roadmap. But apart from the CFC and Arena, we've seen enormous progress from the financial regulators and from business in climate disclosure and making commitments to net zero and to improving their stress testing and scenario analysis. Now, we are seeing quite a lot of fragmentation and slippage of standards and reporting across different sectors and different parts of the economy. One enormous value of having a North Star like the model proposed in the bills is that it operates also as a public good to regulators that are working with their colleagues, the Financial Stability Board, on best practice across the private and public sectors, but also to those businesses, of which there are many, who have committed to improving disclosure and reporting and responses to climate risk and transition. So the consequences of not having that scale and that degree of coordination is a more disorderly transition and greater sort of climate shocks. But I'll hand to my colleague, Sam Hurley, for any further thoughts.
Thanks, Travis. I would reiterate those comments. I mean, I think without a North Star of the kind that this framework provides, we clearly won't make the most of the institutional strengths that we have at our disposal already. Some of those are kind of legacies from the earlier approach to managing climate as an economic issue. Some are more recent, tech roadmap, big new developments like the Asian Renewable Energy Hub, the approach that super funds and financial institutions and corporations are taking to climate risk in Australia. Without a coherent framework and approach, we won't make the most of that momentum and that potential. I think the other point to reiterate is that the cost of not moving, the cost of inaction are going to pile up very fast because the world is moving ahead very quickly on net zero and on climate risk. In the last 12 months, we've seen almost all of Australia's major trading partners make clear plans to reach net zero carbon emissions by around the middle of this century: China, Japan, South Korea, the UK, the US, New Zealand, the EU, etc. Over 80% of Australia's exports to our top 20 trading partners now go to countries with these kinds of commitments. And this momentum is only going to increase this year because climate and decarbonisation is a growing focus, not only for those countries individually, but for their international economic, trade, diplomatic engagements through the G20, the G7, the COP process, etc. So the cost of not moving are likely to be particularly significant as the pace of action increases internationally.
Thank you. A question to Professor Howden. One of the points that you make in your submission is around the possibility or the suggestion that the bill that we're inquiring into would be improved if there was what I will call a sort of a plausible trajectory requirement or some sort of plausible trajectory reference in setting of the 5-year carbon budgets. Would you like to just make a comment on why that's important?
Thanks for the question. So I think my response was saying that there needed to be a cross-reference between the target and the instruments used to achieve that target, and that particularly relates to the monitoring and reporting requirements. And so just ensuring that we actually continuously move to where we want to be, the North Star, according to the previous speakers. But it's, I guess, reflects a view that we really do need an integrated approach here in this bill, which I think it is heading towards, one that deals with mitigation in relation to adaptation and vice versa, one which deals with the sort of economic and social and environment aspects of climate change rather than separately, and one which is proactive, which looks at opportunities rather than reactive and negative, only looking at the costs.
Thank you. That's helpful. All right, just the last question, Chair, to Mr. Merzian from the Australian Institute. Mr. Merzian, if you could just speak a little bit to two related points. One is just an aspect of your submission that goes to what's occurred under the ERF, or now the Climate Solutions Fund, that the government has contracted for 190 odd million tonnes of abatement, but only delivered 50 million tonnes of abatement. And then, I guess, as you pointed out, the funding provided has been stretched out over a longer period of time. But what do you understand about why there is that difference between, well, the delay, I guess, in the delivery of the abatement as opposed to the contracting of it? And then also just what's your understanding of the position of Australia where it comes to the transport sector and the way in which we have apparently fallen very seriously behind the world trend when it comes to the uptake of electric vehicles, even though we are one of the most highly dependent nations and highly vulnerable nations in terms of our liquid fuel reliance.
Sure. Around the Emissions Reduction Fund, or what is now known as the Climate Solutions Fund, and this is the main policy, the main vehicle with which Australia is supposed to reduce its emissions by purchasing credits from the market. Most of these credits come from the land use and forestry sector, and therefore have long time frames and also have methodologies that are often difficult to verify, and often these projects can fall over as well. And so you've seen an abatement number that has come through that is far more modest than what is expected. And given this is the main vehicle through which Australia is supposed to reduce its emissions, this is concerning. Alongside that, the sister mechanism alongside the Emissions Reduction Fund is what's called the Safeguards Mechanism, which is placing a cap on the largest polluting facilities right across this country. However, that cap as well leaves a lot of headroom, which means that a lot of companies that have large polluting facilities have very little obligation to curb those emissions because they're given so much headroom to operate within. A good example of that is the Gorgon gas field out in WA in the north, and the main operator of that is Chevron. Chevron listed the Gorgon gas field as giving it sufficient headroom. The emissions allowed from the Gorgon facility basically bank on it not reducing emissions through the carbon capture and storage facility that it currently has. It had that leeway, which worked out well because it ultimately didn't reduce any emissions through CCS for the first 3 years of its operation. So that's a good example of how the safeguards mechanism is way too lenient, so emissions are not being curbed through that mechanism, and then on the other side, emissions are not being purchased or ultimately undertaken through the Emissions Reduction Fund in the volume that we need. On your second question around transport's a serious concern because it has no policy at the national level to curb emissions in the transport sector, which make up about 18% of our national emissions. And so if you look at electric vehicles, for example, there is no national electric vehicle strategy, despite one being promised numerous times. There is no fuel efficiency standard, which means that Australia has some of the most fuel inefficient cars in the OECD. And then on top of that as well, Australia is also incredibly liquid fuel insecure. 90% of our fuel is imported. And a lot of the times the measures to reduce that reliance is by increasing storage, not by reducing demand. By actually tackling transport, you can do both, and there's real opportunity in it. And a great example actually came last Friday. General Motors announced that it will go all electric for its car line, and it will move to phasing out most internal combustion engine vehicles by 2035. This is important because if the Australian government had the signals in place to start switching our sectors to a clean energy future, there was a real opportunity to maybe keep the Holden brand and General Motors here in terms of some aspect of car manufacturing. And I quote the General Motors boss, who said when she was exiting the Australian market, "We are restructuring our internal operations, focusing on markets where we have the right strategies to drive robust returns, and prioritizing global investments that will drive growth in the future of mobility, especially in areas of electric vehicles." So it's just disappointing that because we don't have those targets, the North Star, as CPD is often referring it to, then we're losing these international opportunities to actually make a serious change, and transport's a good example. In fact, Holden's proving ground, where vehicles are tested, was bought up by a Vietnamese automotive startup company that is being used to test their electric vehicle models, just to put the boot in a bit further. So these opportunities lost, and hopefully transport is the next sector that we address after the momentum that we've built in the electricity sector to date.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, please go ahead, Professor.
Yeah, I was just going to add on the electric car revolution that Australia can play a leading role in our battery metals and refining processing, that we're one of the largest lithium exporters in the world, and we could increase that as well as nickel. So there's opportunities for Australia to get back in.
Thank you, Professor. Let's go to Ms. Steggall.
Thank you for the evidence. My questions have been a little bit touched on, but I wanted to get back to the nature of independent expert advice, because the issue of independent expert advice seems to be conflated by some of my colleagues here as usurping the role of policy and of government. And I know that this is something that's been put in numerous submissions, but maybe particularly the ANU submission, around the importance of informed decision making and the nature of what information should be available. And this question, Mr. Zimmerman's put it to previous witnesses, I've put it to Professor Penny Sackett this morning. The question of, is it appropriate for government to direct a commission to only look at certain science, to essentially pick, as opposed to the science community and the expert community provides all of the information available to the best practice around the world, taking into account other jurisdictions, and it is then for government to come up with policy that best address that. If I could hear from maybe all of you, but starting with you, Professor Howden.
Thanks very much for that question. It's a challenging one, because it comes through to what the nature of our democracy is and how governments intervene in things like business decision making. And for I think a long time we've actually had this view that governments should step back where possible, but set the overarching policy framework, and that seems to have stood us well in terms of the long-term trajectory in which Australia has moved. When governments tend to look at backing winners, as it were, it inevitably takes away opportunities which can be explored by having a broader perspective, and particularly those things which are new opportunities based on new knowledge or new industries or new constituencies, which then get essentially removed from that decision-making process and removed from that support process. In contrast, I think if we do what is generally thought of as best practice in terms of adoption of innovation, then what we would do is similar to what we've suggested in our submission in relation to the Adaptation Centre, which is having an outcome-focused centre. So you have to have agreed outcomes where you want to be in terms of sustainable, profitable, good livelihoods, that sort of thing. And then you bring people in on a participatory basis where multiple stakeholders actually have influence over the direction of those centres and the research that's done on the solutions that they thus explore. And by doing that, you actually end up with a much more effective coverage of the opportunity space as well as the problem space. You end up with both a short-term solutions focus and a long-term strategy focus, and you give voice to a greater number of people, so you get strength from diversity. We know how to do this. We've got a whole range of mechanisms of how to do this. We just don't do it very frequently, because what it's often perceived as is taking power out of the hands of governments who perhaps may want to direct that. If we look at countries where they do have more effective processes like this, including the Scandinavians, we tend to find that they do both well economically and socially and environmentally. So those are in a sense, the empirical examples of where you can do this very effectively. So I think there is room for Australia to move on that, to become more accepting of information in the decision-making processes, in governmental processes, because it actually makes those processes stronger, it makes them better. At the moment, we have disinvested in those processes. Again, as I mentioned in the submission, if you look at what's happened over the last 10 or so years in terms of climate adaptation investment from governments, state and Commonwealth, ever since about 2012, there's been a decline in that adaptation investment at exactly the time we actually need that. If you actually asked a scientist, you'd say, well, we need to increase that investment along the nature of the climate change itself. So as climate change accelerates, we need to accelerate that investment. Instead, what's happened is it's fallen off a cliff, and we're about 70% short of where we would otherwise have been, what the previous trajectory was. So it's an example where governments have actually made calls in terms of where they put the money, and I think you could argue very strongly that hasn't been in the national interest. We haven't been as prepared for things like the Black Summer fires, the floods and droughts, the bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef, etc., as we would otherwise have been. So we need to value expertise more, we need to value information more, and we need to include that more effectively in decision making.
You referred to actually in the submission, the Climate Change Commission suggested in the bill is very much modelled on the UK's climate change, I think it's Commission or Council, I can't remember what they've called themselves now. But have you reviewed, for example, how effective, and they in fact made a submission to the inquiry, have you reviewed how effective that model has been in, I would argue, taking the politics out of getting expert advice to enable government to make a more holistic, informed decision making?
I haven't done a review myself, but I have seen various documentation of that. And there's a broadly held view that it actually has been a successful model, but one which is tailored to their particular circumstances, where you essentially have bipartisan support for climate action. And in that environment, it makes, I think, easier for such a commission to operate and to have its voice heard. A similar one would be the New Zealand example, which is in a sense very similar to the UK example, where it is strongly independent and where it can provide very straightforward advice to the government.
Thank you. I just wanted to, in relation to the evidence we received on Friday from the department is we're doing really well. We're record, and this is maybe for all witnesses, we're doing really well. They provided an attachment that provides a table of how we are reducing our emissions on a per capita basis. I don't know, are you familiar with the table? And in fact, the commentary from the department is there's no need for further legislation. We're doing fine. We're doing better than most other countries. Could I take your views from each groups about whether you agree with that statement, that we're doing fine, that in fact on a per capita basis we're doing well in reducing emissions?
Yeah.
I can provide a copy of the table if that assists. Maybe to Mr. Merzian. Sorry, I can't pronounce it.
That's right. All good. I'm happy to respond to it, probably by way of example. So it would be great to see the data set that sits underneath this so that we can analyse it ourselves. And they've put a number of sources that they've drawn it from there. But my first instinct would be one of concern, because we've been down this path before and it hasn't necessarily been as transparent as we would have liked. So in September 2019, speaking at the UN General Assembly in New York, the Prime Minister claimed that Australia's per capita investments in clean energy technology is the highest in the world today. The Prime Minister then went on to repeat a similar line in question time, claiming again that Australia had the highest renewable energy technology investment in the world. This hadn't been what we found through our analysis, and so through requests to the Department of Energy, we received the sources that they had used to come up with what they believe were the Prime Minister's lines, or used to at least brief up the line. And what it found from the department's sources provided was that Australia was not first, but third behind Sweden and Denmark amongst just 23 countries for clean energy investment per capita. Looking again at renewable energy investment rather than clean energy investment, the Department of Energy provided another source where Australia came in second, not first, and again only from a select group of 30 countries. I'm happy to table the FOI work and also our analysis of this as well, if that would help. The data was only of a small set of countries, and even within those small sets of countries, Australia was not first. Those small sets excluded countries with smaller populations and higher renewable energy investments, like Tuvalu. The data also shows that across the last decade, if you take a longer view than just in the last year, Australia comes in just 5th for clean energy investment, and that's just from a group of 23 countries. Part of the reason why I think there's a big focus on Australia's renewable energy investment per capita is because Australia is playing catch up. There was a renewable bust from 2013 to 2016 caused by policy uncertainty. In 2013 and 14, the renewable energy target was potentially going to be axed by the government. It was then reduced in size. The Clean Energy Finance Corporation was going to be scrapped. The Australian Renewable Energy Agency was going to be scrapped. They remained in place. And so really what you saw was a number of years where there wasn't strong renewable energy investment, and now Australia's playing catch up. The renewable energy target has now concluded, and we're potentially going to see a new horizon depending on the policy certainty we put forward. And that's why it's so important having a bill like this, because it provides that policy certainty about how we're going to move forward so that we can get numbers like this. But without looking at these sources, I can't say that this is what we believe is the case.
Let's go to Professor Howden and then Professor Borovitz, and then we'll go to Mr Zimmerman's questions. Professor Howden.
Thanks for that, Chair. Just in direct response to that, that is the wrong metric. That emission reductions per capita or emission reductions per unit GDP are not the metrics by which Australia is judged in terms of climate change. Is that the metrics are in relation to absolute emissions of greenhouse gases and converted into carbon dioxide equivalents. Okay.
And so there's a range of measurements on
that's right. And I was responding to that very specific question about per capita. And so the focus should be on reducing those absolute emissions, because that is what accumulates in the atmosphere. That is what's causing climate change, and that's why we're here today discussing this issue. If we look at those other metrics, per capita reductions and GDP reductions, that's exactly what you'd expect in a growing economy which is modernising. So that's not unusual for us to have those reductions, but it's simply just not the appropriate metric. And this is not new. So I was involved in setting up the international greenhouse inventories in 1990 and 1991, and also the national ones, and that has been consistent ever since that time, so for 30 years. So from the very start, we've always had a focus on the absolute emissions and reduction of those absolute emissions through all gases, sources and sinks.
Thank you, Professor.
I could just add briefly that per capita is a unit that's used a lot for a small population, large country, but we could do more. We're starting from one of the highest emissions per capita in the world, so reducing it is what we should be doing. Not like proud of doing just enough, we could go a lot farther. So rather than, measuring being just first, like what is the real opportunity and potential, we could go a lot farther. And now is the time to catch up. It's cheaper than ever, so that's all.
Thank you. Mr Zimmerman.
Thank you. I just might make the editorial comment that I think why we get per capita figures is because of the type of statement you just made, which is that often used in this debate that Australia has the highest per capita emissions in the world. So I think it's therefore not unreasonable for the government to occasionally indicate what reductions are flowing per capita in response to some of those.
And if we are doing some editorial work here, the department was also talking about watts per capita, not just emissions per capita, going to your point, Mr Merzian. But nevertheless, Mr Zimmerman.
Thank you. Maybe to Professor Howden, I just wanted to ask firstly whether you've looked at what New Zealand is doing in relation to its 2050 targets. Is that something you're familiar with?
I can comment in general, but not in great detail from a policy perspective.
So they started last year, and I'm not sure whether it's changed, I heard it might be, basically with a 2050 target that related to carbon dioxide but excluded effectively the agricultural sector by excluding methane, and in doing so the New Zealand government argued that that was in accordance with the IPCC's 2018 recommendations for national targets. Do you have a view about, and obviously part of the argument is that methane does not last as long in the atmosphere as CO2. Do you have a view about the approach that New Zealand has taken in that regard?
Yeah, the splitting off on agriculture from other sectors is essentially a political one, which translates into the policy there. And from New Zealand's perspective, with agriculture being about 50% of its emissions profile, how you deal with agriculture really matters. And the challenge there is, whilst there are technologies to reduce emissions in other sectors, such as with electric vehicles or through electric generation, so of power stations moving from coal to renewables, and many other sectors, there are solutions. In agriculture, we don't have those solutions. And so they're stuck with a situation where roughly half of their emissions profile doesn't have easy to achieve ways of reducing that, which don't translate directly to productivity and economic well-being. And so treating agriculture differently, I think, was seen from them as a relatively sensible proposition whilst they worked on developing those solutions for agriculture.
Part of their argument, though, was, and I've read the document they produced at the time, was that the IPC specifically separated methane from CO2, and actually the, I think, 24 to 47% reduction range over 2019-90 levels for methane was language they adopted from the IPCC. So the IPCC seemed to have distinguished in its own work about methane specifically.
So IPCC, ever since the inventories were set up, deals with different sectors, and it deals with different gases within each sector. So yes, you can, and always have been able to hive off methane from agriculture or nitrous oxide from agriculture from emissions from power stations or from waste or whatever. And so that's always been the case, and it remains the case. The description there doesn't quite tally with how both the IPCC operates and in the inventories.
To be
Okay.
fair.
and nor with the Paris Agreement. And so within IPCC, again, going back to a lot, very start, is that there's things called global warming potentials, which adjust for the both the radiative effectiveness, how much of a blanket those gases act in the atmosphere, and also their longevity in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
And so those numbers undergo revision on occasions, and what that shows is that the methane over normal sort of timeframes that we're dealing with, like up to 100 years, is very much stronger than carbon dioxide. So we have a GWP, which is in the high 20s. And so what that says is that when you take out the effect of methane, in the case of New Zealand, they're taking out a big part of their inventory. But what both the IPCC inventories and the Paris Agreement do is they translate all of those greenhouse gas emissions, the methane from livestock, etc., through the global warming potential to an aggregate emission, which is the carbon dioxide equivalent. And the discussion that's sometimes referred to in relation to livestock is that some people have promoted alternative metrics to the one that's used by the IPCC, which is the GWP 100 metric. And that's perfectly reasonable to do, but it doesn't count under the Paris Agreement. So the numbers which count under the Paris Agreement are those which use the GWP 100 methodology. And so even though New Zealand might internally account for its emissions in some other way using some other metric, when they report externally to the sort of global IPCC and UNFCCC agencies, they have to use the GWP 100, and that's been pretty stable for a long time.
Thank you. That's a good explanation. Just turning quickly to the Commission. So the Commission, as it's proposed, is more than a think tank like the Productivity Commission, for example. It has specific responsibilities, like, for example, developing emission reduction plans, I think, every 5 years, if I'm not wrong. And this is where the separation from normal government decision-making is relevant. So normally if the department was asked to develop an emissions reduction plan, it would sit down presumably with the government and work out what the parameters of what was going to be acceptable to the government based on whatever factors it wanted. Don't you see the risk that if the Commission's got the specific responsibility for developing an emissions reduction plan, and develops options which are, for example, options that have already been ruled out by governments in election campaigns or since, so in the current climate, say, carbon tax, or if it proposes options which are unacceptable at the time. So hypothetically, the Commission comes back with a report that says you should deploy small modular nuclear reactors, even though the government has said it's not interested in nuclear energy. Doesn't that risk some of its work being less enduring than if effectively the government was able to work with the Commission and say, this is your target according to the Mission's budget, these are the policy parameters and maybe the political parameters which we think that are acceptable at this point in time, and we need you to develop the strategy within those parameters?
I mean, this is a question which goes to the politics of how that advice would be received from that commission, and that will happen regardless. I think my position would be, and as perhaps a proposition rather than a position, would be that I would hope that if there was effective analysis by both the Commission and by the departments using established robust models and up-to-date parameters in terms of, say, prices of renewables, they would come towards convergence in terms of the solutions. So if that is done well, they should be coming up with very similar answers. And so the gap between what the Commission is suggesting and what government departments are suggesting should actually shrink over time, because there would be that convergence. That presumes that there is transparency, the sorts of things that Richie is commenting on, because that transparency is important so that those two different approaches can learn from each other in terms of what they're doing right and maybe what they're not doing so well. And I think if we approach it with a national interest perspective, then we are relying on that convergence to happen, because divergent views actually can be quite problematic in terms of moving forward in an informed and beneficial way, I think, at a national level. And one of the comments perhaps I could make in relation to MP Wilson's question before about, he asked about possible trajectories of emissions, emission reductions. This is, from a scientific perspective, very clear, is that if we do not start to reduce our emissions now, there is less and less of a chance that we can actually keep to the Paris Agreement goals, is that those interim targets which set that emissions trajectory are just as important as the final target. So it's not just the net zero thing which is important, but it's how you get there which matters.
Well, the emissions road might be clear, the levers you pull to get there can be very different. And particularly when you talk about net, there's a balance obviously between offsets and actual reductions, all those type of things which are policy decisions.
Indeed, and we elect politicians to make those decisions, for better or for worse. But what I'm perhaps positing here is that the information on which those decisions should be made would increasingly become convergent with the analysis that the Climate Change Commission or putative Climate Change Commission makes, simply because there's an improvement in the underlying analytical capabilities by both parties.
And my last quick comment to Mr McLeod would be that the most constant follower of the Northern Star ended up dead on the Senate floor, so be careful what you wish for.
Thank you, Mr Zimmerman. Can I just, while you've thrown to me with that reminder, can I just say one thing about the question of governance and independent oversight?
Go ahead.
So one thing to add, Mr Chair, is that it's very important vis-a-vis the data and transparency business and investors need to meet their pledges and their commitments to net zero or whatever undertakings they've made around climate disclosure. And in our submission, we say that the sort of independent oversight, advice and governance that's proposed in these bills is exactly what you would expect for an issue that will cut across every element of public policy and the economy for most of the next century, self-evidently given the goals we're discussing at least the next sort of 30 years. We could spend a long time discussing the various governance models and whether the PC or Infrastructure Australia, what the right model is, but we think that the bill's approach is fairly sensible. And as the UK Climate Change Committee has said in its own submission, their process has supported more rigorous planning and convergence across sectors in the UK and has brought in other sectors such as health where they've been able to make quite substantial improvements in their own carbon footprints because of the approach that's been enshrined that these bills are model on.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr Burns, and just a quick time check. I'm conscious we've just gone over the session's time, but if everyone's okay for another 5 minutes or so. Mr Burns.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for being here. It's good to see some familiar faces that are getting accustomed to our hearings and our investigations and inquiries. To you, Professor Howden, if I may, you began today by saying that this bill aligns with the science and aligns with the scientific needs and requirements in order to reduce our emissions. I was wondering if you could sort of expand on that a little bit, and specifically about, there is a lot of commentary around net zero. Obviously 2050 is the sort of common endpoint that everyone's talking about at the moment, but the Prime Minister sort of alluded to it preferably by today, but preferably isn't legislated. And in our discussions with the department, it was clear that there isn't any work being done to find out what the actual trajectory is all the way up to 2050 or beyond. So maybe I'll start with you, and if anyone else wants to comment, but specifically on the science, what is Australia's requirements? What should Australia be getting towards? Is it 2050 net zero, or is it sooner or later? Obviously, with reference to the Paris Accord is fine, but yes, I'd be interested in your overview and oversight on that.
Yeah, thanks. Clearly, the trajectory you go on depends on where you want to end up, and where you want to end up depends on an assessment of the costs and benefits of being there versus alternatives. So the Paris Agreement goals, the temperature goals are 2 degrees and if possible 1.5. In terms of 1.5, if we are to achieve that, we do essentially globally have to go to net zero by essentially 2045 or 2050. That date comes closer if we delay action. So if we delay our reduction in emissions now, we have to bring that closer to 2040. So the longer we wait to start reducing our emissions now means that the closer that 2050 target has to be if we're to stay within 1.5. And that's very clear from the science. It's not in dispute. The question about how you do that and what trajectory you go on at the moment is, of course, a question of open disagreement between different parties. But what the carbon budget approach shows that we only have a handful of years at current rates of emissions before we've blown our chance to stay within 1.5. And at which point to stay within 1.5, we've got to go to net zero instantly. Okay, so that's over the cliff type model. Most people would argue that a long, slow glide path model is actually safer and more reliable, and it's more likely to be able to meet multiple needs at the same time. And that's what the science says, is it says if we start reducing our emissions now, we have interim targets which pin us down, which are consistent with that emissions budget approach. We can stick to 2045 or 2050 and still stay roughly within 1.5 degrees. The numbers, if we go to 2 degrees, are net zero by 2070, but again, we have to start reducing those emissions right now. And even so, in both cases, we have to have some what's called negative emissions, where we take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put it in somewhere safe, maybe underground, or maybe in the biosphere, trees and grasses and soils, or maybe in products. But we have to do it somewhere where it's not part of the active atmosphere-biosphere interaction. And the science, again, is quite clear on that, but the amount of negative emissions that you have to have depends on how much you reduce your core emissions, your emissions from coal-fired power stations, from petrol-driven cars, etc.
Can I ask one quick follow-up question? There's a distinguished group that are following you also. I don't want to keep them up. Many of them already joined. So then, by extension of that, if we are to go on this aiming at 1.5, because we've already seen what the consequences are at 1.1 with unprecedented bushfires and all of that. But by the extension of that, if you were to see if you were to design the most straightforward pathway back down to net zero, where would you be advising, or where is the IPCC advising, say, interim targets? The next obvious big marker is 2030. Where is your thinking on with 2030 at the moment, or where Australia needs to be?
Yeah. So if the IPCC advice actually goes back a couple of years. So the report, that 1.5 degrees report, was published in 2018, and it was based on research that was done before that. We've moved on 4 or 5 years since that, and so the amount of time that we have to actually do stuff has actually shrunk. And so, because we've kept on emitting roughly at the same levels, in fact slightly higher, and so the answer is that we need all of the actions happening. We need all of the buttons starting to be pressed, which includes things like putting a carbon price as part, or some equivalent thing as part of the systems that we deal with. In fact, I'd broaden that out to say it should be an emissions price. It's not just carbon. We've got nitrous oxide and other gases which don't have carbon in them, so we should actually talk about greenhouse gas emissions prices, not carbon price. Every economist pretty much that I've ever met says that is the most efficient and effective way of reducing emissions from those core sectors, from coal-fired power stations, vehicles, etc.
But where would you be in terms of emission reduction targets?
So we'd need to be doing something like about 40% reduction by 2030, and which is a big ask, but not impossible. But that does mean a whole of system change, which means that some sectors which might not have great options in terms of emission reductions might actually need, in a sense, to be cross-subsidised by other sectors which do have more options. So this won't be equal pain across all sectors.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it. If you have been asked to provide any